I can't decide if I liked the newest Dune or not. Part of me is saying that if I hadn't read the book, I wouldn't be dissatisfied, because I couldn't compare. Another part of me is saying that without the book, I wouldn't understand most of what I was seeing. Guess I'll have to wait for part 2. In the meantime, instead of just reviewing the movie or diving into how it handled the themes, which I can't honestly do since the story isn't done yet, I'd like to examine what it is about Frank Herbert's 1965 opus that makes it such a challenge to adapt. Not all the struggle filmmakers have with the source material is due to its size, but also what people would call its stilted or clunky nature. Dune is a great story, but let's face it, the book is a freaking brick sometimes. The prose are largely a series of statements strung together, and while Herbert sets scenes very vividly, he often tells what his characters feel, rather than show it. Also, there's head-hopping. Lots and lots of head-hopping. Quick explanation. Head-hopping is when a book jumps from one person's mind into another without warning. Typically, quality writers work with a very focused point of view, and if the book has multiple point of view characters, the switch from one to another will generally be with a new chapter or scene. Mr. Herbert commits in Dune what is considered a cardinal sin of writing, and jumps to whoever's thoughts he feels like in that moment. So now, when the book goes into the hands of screenwriters, well, they're not used to working with head-hopping because it's considered bad form and doesn't pop up very much. And so much of the character's key thoughts and insights occur in those little asides. Hence, David Lynch tried to recreate them, and most people would agree the results are cringy.
Not sorry enough.
What's wrong with Gurney? He's not faking this.
Now, guard yourself from truth.
And Villeneuve ignored it, leaving out many of the characters' internal struggles or adding scenes to show them instead. Resulting in less time to adapt other scenes and a heavily streamlined adaptation. For instance, in the book there's a whole subplot of trying to find the traitor in House Atreides that is absent in the film and leads to my favorite scene in the book. Guess we're not gonna get that in the sequels. Darn. So far, it might sound like I've been overly critical of Frank Herbert, but the truth is, Herbert used so many tools that are either downright unusual or considered outright bad, possibly only getting away with it because the book was picked up by Chilton Books, a publisher that apparently made its bread and butter by publishing auto-repair manuals, and so probably didn't have a staff of professional story editors to correct him. But Herbert managed to completely pull it off. The head-hopping created a unique and intimate atmosphere where the reader knows everything and still feels paranoid. And since Herbert doesn't really go for descriptions of technology, except when very necessary, but more on that later, the world of Dune is really inside the heads of his readers, creating an experience like no other. In a way, Frank Herbert is kinda like a Tommy Wiseau or Ed Wood sort of creator, except that his unconventional approach, with nothing but time and a typewriter, somehow yielded a masterpiece that plagues experienced writers and directors with big budgets. And the reason his book seems brickish isn't because it's hard to follow, but because readers have to learn his unique style, which was probably crafted over years of being a journalist. I would go on more about his technique, but Man Carrying Thing did an excellent analysis of Herbert's prose, so I'll leave a link to that in the description and just move on. While both of the films have tried to deal with the themes of the story, they did sacrifice the extended cast. Gurney seems to be the first one with pieces left on the cutting room floor. No Balasset playing, no poems, his relationship with Paul doesn't seem as warm as it is in the book, and I actually blame filmmakers' obsession with Duncan for that. Both versions have Duncan Idaho show up much earlier than in the novel, and it's my belief the makers of both films doubted that his death would matter, or simply saw it as unimpactful and a wasted opportunity to pull on some heartstrings. So they elected to increase his role in Paul's journey, having him supplant Gurney Halleck as his friend and mentor. Maybe there's such a pervasive writing formula among film writers that they try to fit everything to its shape, like maybe there is a rule stating that mentors must die. But many of these changes are also likely practical. Duncan comes into the story on page 98 and dies on page 241, whereas that doesn't translate so well to a film trying to tell the whole story, like Lynch did, or adapt well over half the book, like the newest version, so it's likely a combination of both factors. Now, this isn't to say these choices with Duncan, Idaho are all bad. In fact, I quite like the extra scenes in both films, but I just wish it didn't come at a cost to others like Gurney Halleck and Wellington Yue. To backtrack a little to the head-hopping, part of why the characters of Dune are well realized is because all the principal ones have both an external struggle and an internal struggle, and we, the readers, get a shortcut into those inner workings via the head-hopping. So, with the inner thoughts removed along with certain plot points, many of the characters lose dimensionality. The only solutions I can think of would be to risk cringe.
He's more concerned over his men than the spice. I must admit, against all better judgment, I like this Duke.
Or introduce sounding boards for certain characters, which means adding to the movie's workload when the biggest issue for an adaptation is trying to be concise with a doorstopper. One of the big hurdles of writing fiction is explaining things the characters know and the reader does not, which is exacerbated tenfold in fantasy and science fiction. See, a historical film typically won't bother to explain how a flintlock musket works, or bother to depict one accurately, for that matter, because the viewer can just go read an encyclopedia if they want that information. But you can't really do that when someone says some random thing about sandworms. This typically leads to writers either finding an excuse for the characters to talk about whatever needs explaining, leading to stilted dialogue, or introducing a stranger to the world, like John Carter on Mars, or any time traveler or new initiate to a secret organization, so that the veterans can explain things to them.
This is Katana. She's got my back. Cut all you in half with one sword stroke, just like mowing the lawn. I would advise not getting killed by her. Her sword traps the souls of its victims.
Or they might sprinkle exposition through the text, sometimes via internal monologue or narration, or just pile everything into one massive chunk that the reader has to battle through. A technique today considered another cardinal sin known as the info dump.
This is Katana. She's got my back.
Frank Herbert completely avoided most of this by including an appendix explaining the terminology and things of his universe. So, whenever a character throws out a phrase that doesn't make sense in our real world, but people in Dune are familiar with, like Bene Gesserit or the Spice Melange, the reader can just flip back to the appendix and look it up, then return to the story. This means Herbert doesn't need to pause the story to explain things. He doesn't create bizarre situations where characters ask about stuff they would know already, and when a reader picks up Dune for a second or third time, they don't need to get through chunks of information they've already learned, and it's a great example of embracing the potential of a medium. And this becomes a challenge for adaptation, since movies don't have an appendix, and you can't pause when you're in the theater, and go to Wikipedia or something like that. So every detail relevant to the story has to be transplanted into the narrative or left out, creating another problem. Insert info that could bog down the flow of the narrative, or omit information and confuse people. And getting back to what I said about Frank Herbert's often lack of descriptive details of technology, he also wasn't overly concerned with spectacle and doesn't bother giving detailed descriptions of pretty much anything he doesn't absolutely need to, which gives Dune a very literary bent. For instance, when the Atreides leave for Arrakis, he just skips the whole interstellar journey, always keeping the characters in focus. Now, I think it works because books deliver all their information via text, or maps, or sometimes pictures, so a writer has a lot of freedom to ignore spectacle if they so choose, as spectacle and action can actually make for the driest reading.
Well, it would be this. Yeah, go. And he kicked again. And he kicked again. And then he kicked him in a different, cooler way. And then he kicked him with his other foot and dust flew off. And then the problem you're going to run into is, in a film, blow-by-blow is fun.
Films, on the other hand, by their visual nature, are pretty much obliged to include spectacle, which then uses up valuable story time, already a precious commodity in the relatively short medium. The other thing is that Dune seems to attract weird filmmakers who want to make the story weird, ironically overcomplicating Herbert's crisp scenes. A great example is Baron Harkonnen's first scene in the book. Everything about it screams cinematic potential, and for some reason, neither big screen adaptation does it as written. So, not every change is justifiable or excusable or an improvement. Some of them are incomprehensible to me. And if Villeneuve did something I didn't like, it's craft a remake of David Lynch's Dune, knowing how many people are familiar with that, rather than going back to Herbert's original. Case in point, Baron Harkonnen does not fly in the book. Now, I don't want your takeaway to be that I was hating on Villeneuve's Dune. That's not what we do here. Unless it's Thor Ragnarok. In all honesty, Villeneuve's Dune might be the best we're ever going to get on the big screen. Herbert owned his unique approach to writing, embraced the strengths of novels and several genres, crafting a story with far-flung influence. So maybe the best we could hope for isn't something faithful, just something that can stand on its own 2 feet. But for that, we'll have to see how Villeneuve concludes Paul's story. Anyway, this is all just my opinion. Write yours in the comments. I love reading those thoughtful comments. I got a very nice one on my Eternals video. And help me fight obscurity on YouTube by subscribing, and all that stuff. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.